Alright, we are going to start this screencast with the weaknesses of the Treaty of Versailles. So the first weakness is the war guilt clause. This forced Germany to admit sole responsibility for starting World War I, which isn't exactly true, and it's very humiliating for Germany. So this basically doesn't allow for continued peace in Europe, because obviously Germany's going to be upset by this. So you're kind of setting up a scenario where Germany could potentially want to rise up again because they're angry. Another weakness of the treaty is that there is no way Germany could afford to pay war reparations. $33 billion is a lot of money. They're not going to be able to afford to pay this. Okay, the other big weakness in the treaty was that the treaty excluded Russia, which is now, yes, the USSR, the Soviet Union. But the trouble with this was that while Russia didn't finish World War I, or their involvement in World War I, they suffered higher casualties than any other country. But they were excluded from the peace conference. Doesn't really seem fair. Also, unfortunately for them, they're actually going to lose territory as part of this treaty. That is going to be kind of used to carve out some of these new nations that are being created. So they're actually losing some of their territory, and they're not even there to get a huge say-so in it. And the reason they're losing territory is part of that whole idea of nationalism and letting territories reflect who and what they identify with. So if certain groups in Western Russia identified as separate from Russia, they were allowed to kind of they were created as one of those 9 new nations. Okay, I want to now focus on opposition to this treaty, mainly coming from the United States. I want to make it clear before I start this, President Woodrow Wilson was one of the big 4. He was at the peace agreement negotiations in Versailles. He would have approved of the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, he sacrifices most of his points to get the 14th point, the League of Nations, added to the treaty, which it is added to the treaty. But treaties in our government have to be approved by Senate. Okay, so even though Wilson approves of this treaty, it's now up for America to sign what he has designed and come up with. And the truth is that the U.S. does not support this treaty. Okay, there is strong opposition coming from the U.S. About this treaty, or regarding this treaty. Most are believing that the Treaty of Versailles is just too harsh and would potentially cause too many economic consequences down the line. Not just within the United States, but also, or not just within Europe, but also within the United States one day. You know, if Germany's hurting economically, then its surrounding countries could eventually be hurting. That's who we trade with. Thus, our economy could eventually be hurting. If there's too many economic punishments, there could be long-term economic consequences. That's basically why the U.S. is somewhat opposing of the harshness of the treaty. Also, the League of Nations. While Wilson, of course, is a big proponent of the League of Nations because he designed it, and he came up with the idea, many Americans thought the League of Nations threatened the U.S.'s foreign policy of isolationism. And what that is referring to is the fact that if we are to kind of still take on this desire of remaining isolated from foreign affairs, not getting involved, not mingling with foreign nations, kind of staying to ourselves, how will we be able to just stay to ourselves if we're part of this international governing organization? That will be definitely getting involved or meddling in foreign affairs. Also, Americans were suspicious of turning over any sort of U.S. power to a higher authority. Why would you want to potentially turn over any of your government's power to an international governing body. Now, Wilson, though, he refuses to give up on both the treaty and the League of Nations. First of all, he approves of the treaty himself, but the League of Nations is kind of like his baby. I mean, he came up with this idea. It's in the treaty. It's one of the big things that the U.S. isn't getting behind, and that's upsetting him because he thinks it really could be an important tool to promote international peace. Okay, so he's actually going to go on a national tour around the U.S. trying to generate support for the treaty, and more importantly, the League of Nations, explaining why it's important, what it would be good for, how it would benefit us as a country, and he actually drives himself sick. He has a stroke during this tour, and so he's kind of wearing himself out trying to get these ideas promoted. The Senate actually fails to ratify both our involvement in the League of Nations as well as the Treaty of Versailles, meaning the U.S. never joined the League of Nations. Even though it was created and was made official as part of the Treaty of Versailles, we never sign off on it, so we never become involved in it officially. We do kind of maintain our role as observer at the meetings, but that's about it. Also, that's very surprising, is that the U.S. never signed the Treaty of Versailles. We actually have to make a separate treaty, a separate negotiation with Germany in the early 1920s, and when Wilson's not even president any longer. So even though the treaty becomes the official treaty ending World War I, it doesn't have our name on it because our Congress did not ratify it. And again, it's just important to know the difference that Wilson approved, but in our government, according to our Constitution, treaties have to be formally approved by the Senate. Okay, we'll stop here. The last few notes will be given tomorrow, and then we are done for our test and for our semester. Yay! Write down any questions, listen to it again if you have to, and I'll see you all tomorrow.